It's automatic?
No, I mean, you can. It's all the same funny thing.
Okay. Is this ready to go?
Yeah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Can the sisters at the back hear me, or do you want me to put the mic on? You can hear me? Okay. Let me know if it drops off. So let's start off with the quiz. So if you got a smartphone, we go to www.kahoot, kahoot.it, and then they'll ask you for a pin. The pin is 9337560. So it's www.kahoot.it, and the pin is 9337560. So it's again www.kahoot.it 9337560. So let's start this. So this quiz is from last week. So we're covering what we covered of last week. So inshallah, you guys remember. All right. First question. Uhud happened how many years after the Prophet received revelation? Uhud happened how many years after the Prophet ﷺ had received revelation? The Battle of Uhud, how many years after revelation? Sixteen. Yes, 8 questions. So it was 16 years after. Who's got that? Sammy? Good job. Surah Nahl 126 stopped Muslims from doing what? Having a third battle, escalating a response, mutilating bodies, or burying hypocrites. Surah Nahl was revealed that prevented the Muslims from doing something they were going to do. What was those things? Having a third battle, mutilating body, and escalating. Well, this is actually a trick question. There's 2 right answers. Mutilating bodies, but also escalating a response. Sam is still on top. You sound surprised. Of the 699 Muslims, how many Muslims died at Uhud? Of the 699 Muslims that took part in Uhud, how many died? 70, 700, which obviously doesn't make sense, 69 or 22? No, 69. It's actually 70 people of the Medinans died, but one of them was Jewish. So it's 69 Muslims that died.
So 69.
70 on the side of the Muslims, but one who was fighting on the side of the Muslims was a Jewish rabbi. How did the Muslims chase the Quraysh away the next day after Uhud? With reinforcements, with a large dust cloud, with a storm, with campfires. So the very next day after the battle, the Muslims set off to chase the Quraysh away. Which of these will happen? With campfires. That's right, they set up campfires more than there were actually people and scared the Quraysh away. Oh, Bilal's overtaken you, Sami.
I had that one right.
Last words of Zayd ibn Dathina when he was tortured to death was, "O Allah, help me, I see Jannah, I smell Jannah, peace be upon you, O Prophet." Peace be upon you, O Prophet. That when Zayd said this, the Prophet ﷺ, who was in Medina, suddenly responded, "Wa alaikum salam, O Zayd." What was the name of the Sahaba who was bodily raised to the sky? What was the name of the Sahaba who was martyred and his entire body was raised to the sky, and this was witnessed, and the Prophet ﷺ confirmed this as well? Amir, Hamza, Amr, Zaid. It was Amir. Amir ibn Fuhaira, the shepherd, who was released from slavery by Abu Bakr.
That was my answer.
Amir ibn Fuhaira.
Amir.
Amir, not Amr, Amir. How many military expeditions did the Prophet lead 1 year after Uhud? An year after Uhud, the Prophet ﷺ led how many expeditions? 5, 3, 2, 6. It was 3. There was 3 expeditions. In that single year after Uhud, he led 3 expeditions, and that really shows the Muslims did not consider themselves as having been defeated at Uhud. Which Jewish tribe was expelled from Medina after Uhud? Banu Kainuka, Banu Nadir, Banu Ghatafan, or Banu Qurayza? Which Jewish tribe was expelled after Uhud? There was one that was expelled before Uhud. Which was the one that was expelled after Uhud? No, Banu Nadir. Everyone gets different answers. So who won? Number 3 is Kamu. Sammy's number 2. Or you were leading also. Brother Bilal came on top, I think. Bilal was first place. Good job. Okay, Bismillah. Let's start. So, we are now done with Uhud. The Battle of Uhud's finished. And we are in... How many years after Uhud? I need to check this. But Uhud's done. And despite Uhud being a potential defeat, we can't say it's a defeat. We discussed this. It wasn't really a defeat for the Muslims. But the Quraysh had ownership of the battlefield by this time. They took over the battlefield. So however you want to see it. But despite that, the Quraysh were very unhappy. The reason was none of their goals were achieved. They couldn't kill the Prophet ﷺ. They couldn't take out Medina. And now the rumor was spreading that the Muslims actually managed to hold their ground. Not only that, but remember the second fake battle of Badr? Remember how there was rumors and they went to Badr and there was no army? Well, that's spreading everywhere and everyone's saying the Muslims won that battle. So this is really troubling the Quraysh. So they decide that they need one big push, one last push once and for all to completely take out the Muslims. With combination of propaganda and bribery, they managed to build an alliance. So this is all. They managed to build this alliance. In some books they call them a confederacy, some refer to it as an alliance. It consisted of the Jews from Khaybar. Who were the Jews from Khaybar? Which tribe were they? Do you remember? Banu Nadir. Just after Hud, they were expelled and then they went to Khaybar. And despite being expelled and despite being shown mercy, they decided to join this alliance. The tribe of Asad, Ghatafan, Hawazin, the Hawazin clan, and from the Hawazin clan, only Banu Amir refused to join because the lady from Banu Amir, Zainab ibn Khuzaimah, was married to the Prophet ﷺ. Now, this got a bit confusing for me, trying to understand clans and tribes. A tribe is big. Tribe's the big one. Within the tribe, there are clans. So in the Hawazin tribe, the clan of Banu Amir refused to join, but all the other clans joined this alliance against the Muslims. Some books total the number between 7,000 to 10,000. That's massive, absolutely massive for this period. These are numbers that we see more in World War I, World War II. Potentially, sometimes the Byzantines and the Romans are able to bring up armies this big. But for the Arabs, this was unheard of. Usual battles amongst Arabs were 200, 300, maybe about 700 maximum. This is 7,000 to 10,000 Arabs against the Muslims. On the Muslim side, they say between 600 to 900. So huge odds, massive odds. Surah Al-Ahzab chapter 22 takes the word Azab, means the allied forces or the confederacy. That's where the name surah comes from, in reference to this alliance against the Muslims. Not only was it a huge alliance that was formed, it was done so quickly. It was done so quickly that by the time news reached the Prophet ﷺ, they only had 1 week to prepare. And as you can imagine, the Muslims were terrified. They didn't know what to do. There was a lot of conversations backwards and forwards. The Sahaba were trying to decide what to do. Not only were the Quraysh now marching on them, so you can see on there, the Jews, the Asad, the Ghatafan, the Hawazin, everyone, pretty much every big power that was surrounding Medina was attacking them. And so they held a consultation and they were trying to figure out what can they do. In 1 week, what can they do? One thing they decided was, well, there's no point going out. A lesson was learned. Going out like Uhud would not work in this instance. So they decided to stay in Medina. The problem was, even in Medina, it was not safe enough. Until one Sahaba stepped forward and gave a very unique idea, unique to the Arabs. This was not unheard of amongst the Arabs. Anyone know who the Sahaba was? Salman al-Farsi. Salman al-Farsi said, where I'm from, in Persia, we do this thing, we build trenches. They dig massive trenches around what we need to defend. The Arabs didn't know this. They have never heard of this. The Arab warfare was two big armies charge at each other, and the archers on the other side will try to pick out as many as they can. This was the normal strategy. Building a trench, staying behind a trench was unheard of. But the Prophet ﷺ said, that is a good idea. That is what we will do. So, a trench was built, but it wasn't easy. Each stretch of the trench, so each part of the trench was delegated to part of the community. So the Aus would take one part, the Khazraj would take another part, the Muhajirun would take another part. And they would start digging, and they dug day and night without sleep. They were taking shifts. Not only that, men, women, children were digging in this trench. The entire community of Medina was mobilized for the defense. They weren't doing anything else because they knew that this was do or die. If the alliance got through, there would be no mercy. The entire city would be put to sword. The Prophet ﷺ himself jumps into the trench and starts digging with everyone else. And it's interesting, while they're digging, it's narrated that to help ease the tiredness, they would all be reciting poetry, and they would be singing nasheeds in praise of the Prophet ﷺ and of Allah. The Jewish tribe of Qurayza, so you can see just at the bottom, on the southwest corner, that's where the Jewish tribe of Qurayza. Now they're the only remaining tribe in Medina. This tribe readily gives digging equipment and offers it to the Muslims to dig. At one point, as they're digging the trench, they come across a massive boulder, and they try to move it. As much as all the Sahaba jump in, they try to move it, they try to lift it out, and it would not budge. No matter what they do, it wouldn't budge. So the Prophet ﷺ then comes there with his shovel, and he lifts the shovel and he strikes the boulder as hard as he can. Soon as the first strike hits the boulder, there is a lightning flash. And the first lightning flash comes from the south part of the sky. The Sahaba are shocked. It's not normal for lightning to be coming from one particular area during the day. Very bright. The Prophet ﷺ lifts the shovel again and hits it again. The second time, there is another lightning flash, but this time it comes from the north. The third time the Prophet ﷺ hits the boulder crumbles into small pieces, and another lightning flash from the east. The Sahaba are wondering, by this time the Sahaba have lived long enough with the Prophet to know that everything has meaning. If a miracle happens, there is meaning behind it. So Salman al-Farsi goes to the Prophet ﷺ and says, Ya Rasulullah, what was those lightning every time you hit exactly at that time? And why were they from different directions? And the Prophet says something very unique, considering the situation that the Muslims are in. The situation the Muslims are in is there's about 600 to 900 versus 7,000 to 10,000. A small town, pretty much. Medina wasn't a city, you can't call it a city, it was a small town fighting against all the superpowers in that region. And yet the Prophet says this. He says, the lightning flash from the south indicated that very soon the Muslims will conquer Yemen. And the lightning flash from the north, Allah was saying that very soon the Muslims will conquer Syria. And from the east, this is the most incredible, will conquer Persia. Persia was one of the two big superpowers. Byzantine was one, Persia was the other. It's like for us to hear that, I don't know, the Muslims will conquer Russia or China or America. Unheard of. Not only unheard of, in a few days they don't know if they're going to live or not. But this is a promise the Prophet ﷺ says. With everyone, children, men, women, digging in the trench 24/7, they finally managed to complete the trench before the enemy army approaches them. If you've ever been to Medina, there is, can you see that? It's a bit hard. There is a location called the 7 mosques. There are 7 small mosques, and they're located at the command centers of where the Muslims stationed themselves. So along the trench, there were 7 specific centers that the Prophet ﷺ told individual Sahaba to hold that ground. And those 7 mosques are named Al-Fatah Mosque, the mosque of the opening. And then from north to south, this goes Salman Al-Farsi Mosque, because Salman Al-Farsi was stationed there and he was in charge of that area of the trench. Abu Bakr as-Siddiqui Mosque, Omar ibn Khattab Mosque, Ali ibn Abi Talib Mosque, and interestingly, Fatima az-Zahra Mosque. Now, I don't know if Fatima was actually in charge of that place, but what I researched said that those individual Sahaba and Sahabi were located there. If you go now, of the 7 mosques, there are still 6 mosques that you can visit. That's the only indication to where the trench is. However, do you see that road that runs from north to south? I think it's called Asih. The road's called Asih. Approximately, that road indicates where the trench was. So, where the mosque is, on that side, that's where the Muslims were. The trench ran from north to south, approximately where the road is. So these are the mosques. And the enemy forces were coming from the north, from the east. Now, after a very long time of digging, the Muslims are exhausted. They've been digging night and day with little supplies. They are exhausted. And a Sahaba by the name of Jabir ibn Abdullah wants to invite the Prophet ﷺ for dinner. So he goes to the Prophet while he's digging in the trench and says, Ya Rasulullah, come for dinner after you finish your shift. Come and have dinner at my place. And to Jabir's shock, the Prophet turns to the Sahaba who are digging there and says, Jabir's just invited us to dinner at his house. I'm pretty sure we can all relate to an incident like this. Jabir doesn't know what to do. He doesn't have enough food for everyone. He has food just enough for his family and the Prophet. But he can't say no as well. The Prophet's invited them. So he goes home and he makes whatever he can, and he's sweating. He is worried about what's going to happen. After the shift finishes, the Prophet ﷺ and all the Sahaba who are in that area rock up to Jabir's house. And they sit down in front of one pot of food. The Prophet ﷺ raises his hands, makes dua for those who made the food, and then blesses the food. And takes it, and he doesn't eat it first, he hands it to one of the Sahaba. That Sahaba takes a spoonful as much as he wants, and then hands it to another one. And it goes around, and it comes back to Jabir, and the dish is still full. He can't understand how that's happened. I don't know if you know in the Bible about Isa, we hear about the 5 fishes and 2 loaves of bread, how Isa made dua and they multiplied. It's interesting, a lot of Muslims don't know this, but in the Seerah, that similar miracle happens many times. This is just once. There's another instance where the Prophet ﷺ is on an expedition and they ran out of water. And he dips his hand into a sheepskin of water. He makes dua and he lifts it. And as the water is dripping, all the Sahaba start collecting. And for hours and hours, the water continues to drip from his fingertips. There are other instances where he makes dua and the food doesn't run out. This is just once. now we get to the point of the siege. The Quraysh and the Ghatafan tribe come from the north, so you can see the two triangles. They are shocked at what they see. They're not used to this trench. The trench is so wide they can't jump over it, too deep for any of the horses to get into and get out of, and they're surprised and they don't know what to do. On the other side of the trench, the Prophet ﷺ has stationed the Muslim archers. In true Arab fashion, the Ghatafan and the Quraysh charge. They've got numbers, they've got horses, so they charge straight into the trench, but the horses would not leap over it. They stop. And soon as they stop, the Muslim archers pick them off one by one. They try this a few times, and each time, very easily, the Muslims repel the waves of the enemy. They realize this is not going to work. There's no trees around there to cut and put a bridge, and even if they did, by the time they get there, the archers would have taken them out. So they're discussing what can they do. Abu Sufyan is the commander of the Quraysh alliance, and so he's talking with all the other tribal chieftains about what can they do to get over this hurdle, this trench. And the chief of the Banu Nadir tribe, Banu Nadir, the Jewish tribe that was expelled, the chief comes up to Abu Sufyan and says, I have an idea. My brothers, the other remaining Jewish tribe, let me go talk to them. If I can convince them to change sides, the Muslims are in big trouble. See, if you look down there, the trench protects the north and it protects the west, right? But south, there is no trench. The south, the Muslims are relying on Banu Qurayza. Banu Qurayza has a fortress in the south, and they're relying on the Banu Qurayza to hold the fortress and protect the south from the enemy. The chief of Banu Nadir says, let me go speak to them. I'm a Jew, they're a Jew, they'll listen to me. If I can convince them to open the gates and let us come through the south, the Prophet ﷺ is going to have to send some of his soldiers to the south to hold that part off. That means he's going to weaken the northern trench, and we could potentially override them. So this person goes to the Banu Qurayza and starts trying to convince them. Initially, Banu Nadir says, no, we're going to stick with the Prophet ﷺ. Remember, they've also given their equipment to help dig the trench. But this person is insistent. He keeps saying it again and again, I'm the same as you. And he says, look, have you seen the army? There is no way the Muslims are going to survive. One way or the other, they're going to fall. 10,000 versus 700, not going to happen. And when they fall, what do you think is going to happen to you? He said, but if you side with us, when the Quraysh take over, they've promised that the Jewish tribes that were expelled, Banu Nadir and Banu Qaynuqa, we can come back and we will be in charge like we were once again. We will be in charge of the finances, we'll be the richest tribes. Why wouldn't you? This convinces them. Banu Qurayza says, fine. They open the gates and allow the Confederate alliance to come from the south to attack the Muslims. Now the Prophet ﷺ hears of this and he immediately sends soldiers to the south to hold them off. But what does that do? It weakens the north. The Muslims at this stage are in a really, really desperate situation. They are not only outnumbered, but something they didn't expect happened. They've been betrayed, and they're now very, very thinly spread. Yet, they still hold their ground, and they keep fighting wave after wave after wave. So I'll read a bit about why Banu Qurayza did what they did. Banu Qurayza, now the largest Jewish clan in the oasis, openly and actively supported the forces of the Quraysh, going so far as to provide them with weapons and supplies. Why the Qurayza would so openly have betrayed Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is impossible to say. The brazenness indicates that they may have thought that this was the end of the Muslim movement and wanted to be on the right side when the dust settled. Even if the Prophet won the battle, the Qurayza probably assumed that at worst they would be exiled from Medina like the Qaynuqa and Nadir. This defection meant that the whole strategy of the Medinan people collapsed, since the Banu Qurayza's alliance with the enemy opened a breach from inside and gave the enemy access to the city, which meant certain defeat and no less certain extermination of the Muslims. This battle, Uhud and Badr were different. Badr and Uhud were pretty much testing each other's strengths. This battle, Khandaq, really is a battle for survival. If the Muslims did not hold here, Allahu Alam, I don't know where we would be. It's interesting to see how that led to where we are. Would we be in this mosque if things had gone differently at Khandaq? But at this stage where we are now, the Muslims are at their worst. They're barely managing. The only thing that's holding them together is their unity and their sense of purpose. The battle gets so intense that there is no break. Remember, the numbers are in the side of the Quraysh. They're constantly sending wave after wave. It gets so intense, there's no break, that the Muslims that night fight the whole night. None of them sleep, none of them eat, but surprisingly, they actually miss the Maghrib prayer. They're not even able to pray the Maghrib prayer because there's no let. And they're only able to catch up on the Maghrib prayer after Isha. It's very hard. I mean, you have to understand this. We're talking about the Sahaba and the Prophet ﷺ still with them. But it was so intense, they couldn't even pray the Maghrib prayer together. Now, there doesn't seem to be an end in sight, and even the Prophet ﷺ is now starting to worry. He doesn't know how long the Muslims can hold out. And he goes to Uthman ibn Affan and says, shall we negotiate? Shall we ask the Quraysh, shall we negotiate with them to stop this battle? But then Sa'd ibn Mu'adh steps forward and he tells the Prophet ﷺ, no, we cannot negotiate with them. We cannot negotiate with the Ghatafan. It's either we fight or we die. And this convinces the Prophet ﷺ. Now, this is an interesting thing about the Prophet as well. If he got revelation, if it was revelation, there was no negotiating, there was no discussing. The Sahaba knew that it happens because Allah said it would. But if it was an opinion of the Prophet ﷺ, in this case, but also in the case of Badr, remember when the Prophet ﷺ said, let's stop before the wells, and one of the Sahaba said, no, let's stop after. The Prophet was someone that he always listened to his Sahaba, he always took counsel from him. And when Sa'd said, no, I don't think this is a good idea, the Prophet said, okay, I agree. Let's fight and see what happens. That night, something very interesting does happen. A person by the name of Nuaym ibn Masud comes to the Muslim camp and accepts Islam. Now, anyone know who Nuaym is? Walaikum salam. Anyone know Nuaym? He's a pretty interesting Sahaba. We go back in time. Remember the second battle of Badr? Remember I talked about how Abu Sufyan wants to cause fear and says that there's a massive Quraysh army heading to Badr, and he sends someone to spread that rumor. The person he sends is Nuaym ibn Masud. Nuaym has a way with words. He's very good at talking, and for the lack of a better word, he's very good at lying. He's very good at convincing people. So when Nuaym comes and tells the Prophet ﷺ, I want to become Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ is happy, but he says, I have a mission for you. Straight away, he's like, I've got a mission for you. I want you to go back to the Quraysh, go back to the alliance, and see what you can do to break this alliance. The Sahaba are a bit troubled by this. The Sahaba said, but that's lying. The Muslims are not supposed to lie. And the Prophet ﷺ's response is, war is deception. Yes. Yeah. I mean, obviously, if he knew, then it goes back to the Quraysh. That's going to go bad. So, Shaykh Hamza Yusuf talks about this. He says this. The Prophet ﷺ says war is trickery or war is deception. This is also how Sun Tzu in The Art of War begins. This is an ancient principle in warfare. The nature of war is that it's deceptive. In other words, the Prophet ﷺ is telling them that this is a time when deception is permissible. In times of war, one can lie because it is an actual part of warfare. To kill a human being is the worst thing you can do, but in war, it becomes acceptable because that's the nature of war. So things that in normal times are completely unacceptable, in times of war become acceptable because of the nature of war. However, Islam limits what you can do. You cannot mutilate, you cannot kill children, you cannot kill women, you cannot kill religious people, you cannot kill old people, you cannot kill livestock or cut down fruit trees or burn crops. These are rules of war in Islam. So you can be deceptive in war. It's not allowed outside of a state of war, but in war you can. However, even then there are all these very specific limitations. Anyway, going back to Nuaym, the Prophet ﷺ says, go. Don't let anyone know you're Muslim. Go back and see what you can do to break this alliance. Now, I'm a big fan of Nuaym because he is incredibly intelligent. The first thing Nuaym does is he goes down south to where Banu Qurayza is. He goes to Banu Qurayza and he says, you know, I really feel sorry for you guys. You're in a real hard position. It's like a spy, exactly. It's espionage. It's interesting, the Prophet ﷺ had soldiers. He had archers and infantry. He had an intelligence system. He had networks the way he got information. And in this case, he sends a spy on a mission. Nuaym goes to Banu Qurayza and he says, you know, I feel bad for you guys. You're in big trouble. You've supported the Quraysh. What do you think is going to happen if the Muslims win? If the Muslims win, you're in big trouble. Don't think that they're going to just expel you like the others. You might end up dead. And what's the Quraysh going to do? Quraysh are not going to protect you. They're not home. They don't live in Medina. They're going to go back to Mecca. And Banu Qurayza, they were already a bit worried. Now they're starting to really stress. And they say, what do we do? And Nuaym says, look, I have a really good idea for you. Go to the Quraysh and tell the Quraysh, we need some hostages from your side. Send us some people that can stay with us as a guarantee that should the battle go bad, you guys won't leave us and abandon us. And Banu Quraysh says, oh, that's not a bad idea. That's a good idea. I'll do that. Yeah, we'll send a message and we'll tell the Quraysh and the alliance to send some people to stay with us. Before that happens, Nuaym goes quickly to Abu Sufyan, the Quraysh and the Ghatafan. And he goes to Abu Sufyan and says, oh, Abu Sufyan, I don't trust Banu Qurayza. They already betrayed the Muslims. What makes you think they're not going to betray you? I bet you before soon, they're going to come to you and ask something like, I don't know, maybe to give you some hostages. And Abu Sufyan says, do you think they'll do that? He's like, I'm sure they'll do that. Very soon, within a matter of hours, a message comes from Banu Qurayza saying, we would like some hostages from you. And Abu Sufyan's paranoia goes through the roof. So Abu Sufyan's like, I knew it. I knew they were going to, you were right. So he now split Banu Qurayza and Abu Sufyan. So they're no longer talking together. They're no longer passing messages. And first, he's already made one issue, the alliance starting to break.
I'm laughing because we are at the receiving end. The Americans are doing that between the Saudi and the Persian, if you will think about it.
It's interesting. If you look at the battles, the Battle of Badr, the Muslims won because of really divine intervention. If you were here when we covered that, we saw how there was actual evidence of angels fighting in that battle. But after that, the battles, that didn't happen. Allah didn't send angels. At Uhud, the Quraysh, hard to say won, but the Quraysh took over the battlefield because of their military strength. They had cavalry. And the Muslims didn't listen to the Prophet. But at Khandaq, the difference at Khandaq was there was unity amongst the Muslims. They thought as one. They listened to the Prophet ﷺ as one. There was no, discussing and negotiating. None of that. What the Prophet said, they did. But despite the numbers of 10,000, the alliance did not think as one. Everyone wanted to be the leader. Everyone distrusted each other. Banu Qurayza had their own motives. The Quraysh had their own motives. But the other tribes, what were their motives? The Ghatafan, Asad and Sulaim, they joined the alliance because the Quraysh said, we promise you, you'll have all the wealth of Medina. But now it's been weeks, it's been 2 weeks. They're fighting, they're losing. Not only have they not got wealth, their wealth is running out. Their supplies have run out. And now the Ghatafan and the other tribes are starting to say, why did we even join this? This is where we're using up all our supplies. And so the alliance is starting to break very quickly. The difference is amongst the Muslims, they're still united. They're suffering, they're struggling, but they're still very united. This is actually discussed in the book. It says, the Muslims had a valuable asset in their comparative unity and better discipline, which contrasted with the lack of cohesion in the alliance and the lack of mutual confidence between the various groups. Of this unity, Prophet ﷺ's diplomacy took full advantage. The whole was a battle of wits in which the Muslims had the best of it. With cost to themselves, they weakened the enemy and increased dissension. Like you said, isn't it unfortunate that we don't think this way anymore? You know, we have a tendency now that even if, I'm not talking about battle, but in anything that we're having a conflict, usually we think with our arms. You know, we go head on, smash our heads against, like the Quraysh did against the trench. They just sent wave after wave after wave of people to die. The Muslims used their brains. The Muslims were united, they used their brains, they thought how they could bring them down slowly. They knew they didn't have the numbers, so how could they win? They thought of different ways. And unfortunately, doesn't seem to be our strong attribute anymore. But that is what won this war. Khandaq won because of the intelligence of the Muslims and the unity of the Muslims, and we are here today in this mosque because of that. Allahu Akbar. Now, despite this, even the Muslims are suffering. They're under siege. They're not getting any food coming in. They're starting to struggle. So the Prophet ﷺ makes dua and he says, Ya Allah, help us. Few days later, a storm hits the battlefield like it's never seen before. It is so strong that the enemy tents are literally lifted off and blown away. The few supplies they have are overturned. This doesn't affect the Muslims as much because they're in Medina. They have their houses to go to. Whereas the Quraysh, they're living off tents. Their tents are blown away. Their food supplies destroyed. This was the final straw. Ghatafan, the Quraysh, everyone's like, that's it, we're done, we're going. And they leave. The defeat at Khandaq is massive. The breakup of the Confederacy marked the utter failure of the Meccans to deal with the Prophet ﷺ. The outlook for them was dismal. They exerted their utmost strength to dislodge them from Medina, but he remained there more influential than ever as a result of the fiasco of the Confederacy. Their trade with Syria was gone, and much of their prestige lost. Even if Muhammad ﷺ did not attack them, they had no hope for retaining their wealth and position. But he might very well use armed force against them and try to annihilate them as they tried to annihilate him. It would be strange if some of the Meccans, a practical people, had not begun to wonder whether it would not be best to accept the Prophet ﷺ and his religion. It's interesting. I remember when I was a Christian, I heard one pastor tell me once, he said, the bigger the trouble, the bigger the reward. In the case of Khandaq, that was the case. It was a big problem for the Muslims. Huge, 10,000 strong. They pretty much they're going to be annihilated. But being victorious from that problem, the victory was huge. The Meccans were completely gone. They used up all their wealth, they used up all their power, everything they had, and yet they couldn't defeat these few Muslims. Their prestige was gone. No other tribe would see them as the leading tribe anymore. Their wealth was gone. They can't trade with Syria because the Medina is up in the north. Their men were gone. Their army was gone because they've been annihilated. This Khandaq is the key point in which the Quraysh power is gone forever and they can never regain it. And it is the key point where people take note that the Muslims are here, they're going to stay, and if anything, they're going to start spreading. So put yourself a few days, 2 weeks before, and the Muslims were thinking this is the worst we can experience. 2 weeks after, the Muslims are at the highest point that they've ever been. I guess that's a lesson for us as well when we're going through difficult times, very hard times. To try and remember that, after ease comes hardship, after hardship comes ease, but that ease the harder the hardship, sometimes the ease is also greater. How are we doing with time? Because the clock stopped working. All right, so we'll get close. Now we're getting to a very quote-unquote controversial point. A lot of people like to use this to say that Muslims are barbaric. How could they do this? Now the Quraysh have left, right? The Ghatafan have left. But who's still there? Banu Qurayza. In the morning, the Quraysh leave. That afternoon, Jibreel himself comes to Prophet ﷺ and says, no time for rest. You need to deal with Banu Qurayza. Jibreel tells him. So the Prophet ﷺ sends about 300 soldiers at the head of Ali. Ali's leading them to Banu Qurayza. And sieges the fortress. And they're sieging them for about 25 days. At the end of 25 days, one of the Muslims, his name was Abu Lubaba. Abu Lubaba had good relations with Banu Qurayza. So Banu Qurayza says to Abu Lubaba, what do you think we should do? Should we surrender or what? Abu Lubaba says, I think you should surrender. But then he points to his neck, pretty much saying, you should surrender, but I wouldn't have a lot of hope. You guys have betrayed your pact. You've done treason in the middle of a battle. I don't have much hope for you. But suddenly Abu Lubaba feels horrible. He's like, why did I say that? Because now I would have betrayed the Prophet ﷺ. And he's feeling so bad that he goes and ties himself to a pillar. And he says, I will not be released from this pillar until Allah forgives me. This is very significant because this is an indication of what's going to happen to Banu Qurayza. When the Prophet ﷺ hears news, that Abu Lubaba tied himself, Prophet ﷺ says, why did he do that? If he came to me, I would have forgiven him. I would have made dua and forgiven him. But now that he's tied himself, we can't do much. So we'll continue rest from next week, inshallah.